I almost hate to ask this, but
Bring it on.
in your opinion, what is more secure, Apple or Android? Hello. It's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today, I'm here with Miss Hahna Latonick. Hahna, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you, Jacob?
Doing great. Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all the things. Really helps me out. Thanks in advance. Hahna, tell us about your background and how you got to where you are today.
I appreciate the opportunity to come on the podcast. It was great for you to reach out, and really looking forward to our discussion today. I'm Hahna Latonick. I currently serve as the Director of Security Research for Darkwolf Solutions. We're a technology firm that offers cybersecurity, software DevSecOps, as well as digital transformation services for both federal and commercial organizations. So I joined Darkwolf back in February 2023, and I've been working across the defense industry for about the past 18 years now, specializing in both offensive and defensive cyber for the Department of Defense, as well as several defense contracting companies. So my expertise, it's in reverse engineering, vulnerability research, exploit development, as well as machine learning. One of our main focus areas right now is Android security research. So I was excited when you reached out saying, hey, let's do a podcast about this topic. But also, in addition to that, I've been featured as a cybersecurity subject matter expert on Fox Business News, ABC, as well as other national media outlets. So that's a little bit about me, but again, appreciate the opportunity of being on here to further discuss Android security.
Well, we have all of these smart devices and we're just bringing them into our day-to-day, including at work. So back in my day when I was growing up in the 90s, I didn't get a smartphone, like the DoD training. Can I borrow your smartphone?
Oh, hey, sorry. I saw you had a smartphone. I was wondering if I could check my work email on it. It would really help me out.
Yeah, my first phone was like a Nokia brick, right? Playing Snake on it. So I totally understand.
Right.
Yeah.
But these days, they're so common. They're everywhere, right? And so people really don't think when they bring a mobile device into play at work. And that kind of goes right into the next topic, which is in the Android ecosystem, there's so many different makes and models out there. Talk to us about what's different or even comment about the different makes and models out there.
Yeah. So what's great about Android is that it's very easy to customize, especially since it's open source, right? We have the Android Open Source Project, or ASOP for short. But because of the ease of customization and the diversity of options that you have out there for Android, it's created this fragmented ecosystem with a diversity of Android operating system versions, device manufacturers, firmware types. And so the way I like to break it down is that you have essentially the basic ASOP ROM, right? You can think of this as the base image that's created from the publicly available ASOP repository, right?
Go ahead and define that.
Yeah, so ASOP, the Android Open Source Project. Yep. So because it's very long to say, whenever I refer to AOSP, that's what I'm referring to. And then you have the stock Android ROM, right? ROM being read-only memory, usually referring to like a firmware image. So you have the stock Android image. What this is the base ASOP image plus Google proprietary software, right? This is what's usually shipped to phone manufacturers. And then you have this third category of custom ASOP images that the manufacturers will create, adding their own functionality, proprietary software, as well as custom drivers to work on their specific device, whether that's Samsung, Google, Motorola, and so on, right? And so that's really where the variations kind of stem from, as far as operating system differences, hardware, as well as we'll just say the core apps that are included with the Android device that you might purchase.
That's really interesting. And what's also interesting is This brings up a memory when we were looking at a vulnerability that we thought affected our Android. It was Samsung devices, okay? And it only impacted certain Samsung devices that had a particular type of chipset, but that chipset was only sold internationally, not in the United States. So US customers were not impacted, but international folks were. And of course, they neglected to say that,
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, you got to know the pieces and parts, and it does get complicated.
And you bring up a great point, right? They're even for a single manufacturer, they may have an international version versus, say, a US based version, or another version that's restricted to a particular region, right? So that's just another layer of customization and diversity that we have to account for as well.
Well, what are the brands that you like?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm going to be completely transparent here. I actually use an iPhone, right? I know, I get it all the time. But yeah, right. It's the great debate, Apple versus Android, right? And so for me, like, I'm not necessarily like, since we work with a lot of vendors, right? I can't necessarily recommend a particular brand, right? We try to remain like vendor neutral, given the services we provide. But personally, I use an iPhone. It's nothing against Android. It's just I find the UI better for me for iOS. And it's just a better user experience for me. But I do have a lot of friends that, have the latest like Samsung S23, S24, or Google Pixel, right? So again, I would say use whichever device or specific Android version that you prefer. Yeah, that's pretty much how I kind of approach that debate question. So.
Right. Well, I've got a work buddy that's going to give me a ton of grief now. I see you, Daryl.
Yeah.
I might cut that. I don't know. We'll see.
That's up to you.
That's so funny. All right. Well, that's very interesting. Let's dive into the update and maintenance lifecycle and what that looks like. We have all of these different ecosystems, all of these different brands, models. So what does the update process look like?
It's quite complicated, right? And there's a lot that you don't see as an end user that's like happening behind the scenes, right? So first and foremost, it starts with the Android open source project, right? That's Google owns Android. They are like the main maintainers of the Android code base. And so whenever we'll just say an Android update, right? Google will release that updated source code via their ASOP repository, right? This is going to include any major version updates. For example, Android 15 just came out last week, right? As well as if there's any major security patches, it's always going to start with the ASOP. And then, of course, Google, since they own Android and they also have manufacturer mobile devices, they're going to push it out to their ecosystem first, right? Pixel devices will usually get the updates directly from Google shortly after they're announced. But then we have the next stage, is where the manufacturers come into play, right? So if you take Samsung, for example, or other manufacturers, they're going to take that updated ASOP code and they're going to customize it for their specific hardware, right? They might have to make updates to their drivers. They might have to make updates to their features, or even their UI, right? And then from there, they're going to go through their own test and evaluation process to make sure that the changes and updates are compatible. There's no performance issues. And that can actually take some time, right? But it doesn't stop there. We also have the carriers that then enter the picture, right? They're going to add their own touch where, in some regions, mobile carriers, they may have their own apps, right? For example, I have Verizon. I have Verizon apps on my phone. Same with like AT&T, even, other carriers as well, right? But they want to make sure that the carrier service that they're providing is also compatible with the latest updates. They're kind of like rolling downstream, right? So they might need to make network configuration updates to ensure compatibility. And again, the carriers are going to go through their own test and evaluation and getting approval before pushing those updates out to their customers, right? So eventually, you finally get the update as an end user, as an operator. This is usually distributed over the air to eligible devices, and that's one thing to keep in mind is that depending upon your device version or Android operating system version, it might have reached end of support or end of life where it's not eligible, where that update doesn't work on the version of Android that you're using or the device that you're using. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. But ultimately, eventually, these updates, they're going to be usually pushed out or rolled out in a staged, phased approach, whether it's to different devices or to different regions, just to make sure that the carriers aren't overwhelming their servers, to ensure that there's no massive network potential issues. It's quite an involved process that, again, many people don't see or don't realize. But the great thing is that as an end user, I don't have to worry about that. It's all working smoothly, right? That way I can, play the latest game on my mobile phone securely, at least.
Android offers a number of authentication methods. I think the pattern is still even out there, then there's PIN, the password and fingerprint and the iris or face. Now let's talk about just a higher security type environment. Would you not touch any of those authentication methods?
For me, I always like to take a hybrid approach, right? Yes, biometrics, they do offer a more convenient way to engage with technology, right? Especially if your hands are full, you're carrying your coffee. It's like, hey, just use my face to unlock my device, right? But biometrics do potentially provide a less secure way of not only confirming your identity with the device, but potentially jeopardizing confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that device, right? So the primary authentication methods that are typically recommended, as you mentioned, is using a PIN, a pattern, or a password. And then you can couple that with a secondary authentication method, such as a Face ID, fingerprint, or iris. And the reason why their biometrics aren't considered a truly strong approach is that they have a higher risk of spoofing, right? So for example, before devices were using 2D face recognition, well, you can just bypass that with a photo, right? And so instead, in that example, you want to make sure your devices are using three-dimensional face recognition if you do enable that biometric, right? But I'd say the main takeaway is that although it's convenient, right, it shouldn't come at the cost of security. So just make sure you're choosing whichever biometric option is best for you, but always prioritize strong passwords and following robust security practices.
Okay, let's talk about rooting Android devices. MDMs, they have compliance settings where you can check if a device is rooted. A lot of people seem to like it because it gives them a lot of control, like basically root on the device. So what does it mean and how does it give you more functionality, but also why can it be dangerous?
Yeah, so rooting is the phrase that's used for the Android ecosystem. Jailbreaking is equivalent, but for iOS and iPhones, right? But essentially what's happening here is when you root your device, you're elevating your privileges so that you can, for example, load a custom ROM or a custom image onto your phone. It can also, with your elevated privileges, you can think of this as having the highest level administrative privileges on the device, right? You're admin, you're root, right? And so with that, you have the ability to read whatever data you want, execute any data, as well as write any data that you want as well, right? You essentially own the device.
Mhm.
And with those privileges, you can use them for good. Maybe you just wanted some additional customizations on your phone, right? But there's two sides to every coin. Being able to root your device for malicious purposes, right? And so from a cybersecurity perspective, you want to make sure that the end user has the least privileges for that device, right? And that you're preventing that user from reading data that they shouldn't, from writing data that they shouldn't, like to data storage, or executing their own code that could be malicious, right?
Mhm.
And so by preventing, rooting, or implementing, very strong security measures, you can prevent attackers from obtaining that level of privilege.
Mhm.
That way, they can't steal your data. It prevents them from, for example, installing malware on the device, and executing their own code. So when it comes to rooting, you especially just from an IT perspective, if it's a part of your procedure, you just want to make sure that you're doing it properly and with approval, of course. But it's definitely a sensitive topic because when you root your phone, you have a lot of power, right?
Mhm.
And with a lot of power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, and I guess it all makes sense because if you're trying to put an MDM on somebody's phone, but they have root privileges, I mean, they could do whatever they wanted and just bypass the MDM completely. It's the same concept with Windows.
Exactly.
We're trying to lock our device down for our children, but they have admin and they can bypass everything. You know what I mean?
Exactly. They can
Same
just bypass
concept.
parental controls. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about SIM swapping. What is it and how can an attacker use it?
What exactly is a SIM, right?
Yeah.
So SIM, right, stands for Subscriber Identity Module. Essentially, your phone usually has a SIM card. It's a small plastic card containing a chip with identifying information for that mobile device, right?
Mhm.
So this information is going to help your mobile service provider like Verizon or AT&T connect devices to customer accounts. And so when it comes to SIM swapping, it's funny because I actually last week just upgraded my phone, but SIM swapping involves transferring your phone number to another SIM card, such as when you change or upgrade to a new phone. I just got the iPhone 15. I wanted to keep my number. And so we'll talk about what's interesting for the latest iPhones as well, but latest mobile devices. But there is a malicious use case for SIM swapping, and this is when an attacker attempts to impersonate you, right? And they're doing this so that they can then convince the mobile carrier to transfer your phone number to a SIM card that's in their possession and not yours. So the ways that they're able to potentially achieve this, as far as impersonation techniques, they often utilize like social engineering or OSINT, which is open source intelligence, where they gather a lot of information about you enough so that they can then impersonate you when interacting with the mobile carriers, right? But the goal with SIM swapping is that they're trying to clone your phone number. That way they can gain access to your calls, your messages, your photos and videos. But most importantly, what they're going after are the two-factor authentication codes, which get sent to your number. Because if they can obtain those, then they can then gain access to your accounts or take them over, right? So why would they want to do this? Go through all this effort, and usually the main goal or motive it's usually financial, right? They're trying to gain access to your banking information, or they might want to steal your identity for other scamming purposes.
Well, that's really interesting. I remember reading a report from Coinbase, which is a cryptocurrency platform. And they said that it was a huge, high percentage. I don't know, it might have been upwards of 90% of the account takeovers on Coinbase were accounts that had the text messaging based multi-factor authentication. And like, I really don't get it why people still use that, even banks. Sometimes that's the only thing you can use. And honestly, for me, it's like, if I have a choice, I don't even want to enable that. I just use a strong password, because sometimes the text message can be used to reset your password. And so I don't know. I just think it's dangerous. I can't wait till we get away from it.
It's tricky. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a delicate balance, but as always, attackers are getting smarter. Their phishing campaigns, as well as not just over email, but over SMS, right? Smishing, are becoming very realistic, where it's getting, I would say, easier, or the barrier of entry for impersonation is getting lower each day. So again, taking a hybrid approach, and sort of having that layered defense in depth in place just to protect yourselves, as much as you can.
Now, another question. I understand there's a SIM and then there's an eSIM. What's the difference? And then what would an account takeover look in that context of an eSIM?
Yeah. So, and that's what's interesting with my latest upgrade. So, it's the first time I've encountered having an eSIM, right? So with the iPhone 15, and I imagine more modern Android devices are going to be doing this as well, where you no longer have that physical SIM card in your phone. Instead, what the providers are doing is they're essentially assigning two sets of information to your phone, two identifiers, IMEIs specifically, but these are two identifiers that are virtual, and when used together can verify and confirm your device as well as its association with your accounts, right? So eSIMs were introduced as a way to improve mobile security. It does make it harder for account takeovers, but it's not a silver bullet, right? There's still other ways in which people can impersonate you, get those two-factor authentication codes to gain access, but it does just make it a bit harder.
Now, isn't there an attack where you can leverage the trust relationship that the actual cellular network, so the cell towers, have with the phones, and do some interception based off of that?
Yeah. So over the air attacks, these are pretty interesting, right? So with cellular towers, right? Essentially, you have your mobile device is communicating with a cellular tower. You can actually impersonate a cellular tower. We call it like a rogue base station, or a rogue access point if you're talking about like wireless networks. But essentially, it's the attacker is able to trick your phone into connecting to them rather than the legitimate cell tower or wireless access point. And so from there, you think that you're having a secure, trusted communication through that network, but essentially the attacker is performing a man-in-the-middle attack. And through that, they can potentially read your messages. They can send you fake, or to say, two-factor authentication codes, right? But over-the-air attacks, I would say they're not as common. They do occur versus like just network-based attacks. But there is a higher barrier of entry. They're very quite, I would say, complex attacks that can occur. So a couple things that I always recommend is, make sure you're connecting to a secure wireless access point. If you're using Bluetooth, make sure that you're using secure pairing, that you know what you're connecting to. And of course, use a VPN, especially if you're on a public Wi-Fi network, or you're in a region, in an untrusted region. Use a VPN to encrypt your communications. So over the air attacks, they're pretty they're pretty interesting. They're quite intriguing, but are definitely much harder to carry out compared to your typical network attacks that you often see.
I think that SIM swapping is interesting. And I listened to a Darknet Diary episode where they were saying certain carriers are more resistant to SIM swapping and the social engineering tactic that you mentioned. And so I think Verizon was, at the top, there from that person's perspective anyway. And so Verizon costs a lot of money, but when you actually partner, when you buy a phone with a specific carrier, because these two-factor text messages are still used in a lot of different places, you're almost partnering with them from a security standpoint, and you are because you're relying on them not to get socially engineered. So it's kind of interesting.
Absolutely. One thing I always recommend is not only using a mobile device that has a proven track record, such as Android, as well as iPhone and iOS. But you bring up a great point with our carriers, right? They introduce additional attack surfaces and attack vectors. And so by partnering with a carrier that takes security seriously, they have a proven track record of sending out updates and making sure that not only are they providing a quality telecommunications to their end users, but it's also secure as well to use.
Well, let's dive into the fun stuff now. How are Android phones typically compromised?
Wow, where do we start? And that's in general, right, when it comes to mobile security. But often with Android applications and just mobile apps, compromise is often through downloading a malicious app, right? You might think that it's a legitimate app on the Google Play Store, but it may have some malicious code or was developed by a malicious third party. We often see phones becoming compromised by the user clicking on a malicious link via a mobile app. For example, we touched upon SMS phishing, right? That is still a common attack method. And also, as we've been emphasizing to update your operating systems and applications often, it's still an issue where apps are, contain known exploitable vulnerabilities that haven't been addressed, right? And that just opens them up for, potential exploitation, whether it's by sending an image. For example, Instagram had reported a vulnerability where you could craft an image that when opened by the app, it can result in remote code execution. Same thing with a lot of major, I would say, video media players, such as like VLC, for example. It's also open source, where you can craft a video that when played or even when opened, it can result in remote code execution and the attacker taking over the phone, or even just by opening a data file that you get, right? Maybe someone sends you a malicious PDF and you open it via the mobile PDF viewer. So it's applications containing known exploitable vulnerabilities is a serious topic that needs to be addressed. And the best way we can protect ourselves is by updating them often when possible. But I also bring that up because what we're seeing more of as I would just say an attack trend are these zero-click attacks that require no user interaction, right? Which is pretty daunting to think about, where you could just be walking down the street, or you just get a random phone call, right? Or a random text message, and you don't even have to interact with that data or call that you receive that could produce different types of cyber effects, right? Usually it's local privilege escalation to become root or admin, as well as, achieving remote code execution. So
yeah, and I agree that is absolutely insane. And I'll say just, from my Androidness, this is for my friend Daryl. I know iOS had a few of those vulnerabilities over time, so, it happens to all of them. But hey everyone, Jacob here. Let me tell you about today's sponsor, Vanta. As the number and severity of third-party breaches continues to rise, companies are increasingly vigilant, not just about how they handle their own data, but how their vendors do as well. For security and compliance leaders, this means more security reviews are coming across your desk every day, and valuable time is being wasted on manual security reviews. With Vanta questionnaire automation, security and compliance teams can complete security reviews up to 5 times faster, giving you time back to focus on running your security and compliance programs. Over 8,000 global companies like ZoomInfo, Smart Recruiters, and Noibu use Vanta to save time on security reviews. Visit vanta.com/GRC Academy to learn more about questionnaire automation. That's vanta.com/GRC Academy. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Let's dig into that, what you just mentioned before about you get a text message that allows remote code execution to an attacker. What does that actually mean? And then also, what can the attacker do?
Remote code execution or an RCE, right? Essentially, the attacker is able to control the code execution of that application or of that device, right? And usually they want to get what's called a reverse shell, where let's say, we'll just use you and I, for example, right? Let's say I send you a malicious text message, and let's say it's just an article, right? You click it. I'm able to, as that article is rendering and being processed, I'm able to redirect the code to my what we call shell code, but essentially we'll just call it malware, right? It gets redirected to my malware that runs, and then now I'm going to get a shell back to my machine, right? Back to my device, where I can, here in my lovely home in Florida, I can issue commands to your phone and get access to, I can read data, I can write data. Maybe I want to drop another malware on your device, so I have persistence, right? So maybe a week from now, I want to gain access to your phone again, right? And so remote code execution just opens up a lot of possible, we'll just say, future attacks, right? And usually it's a pivot point to more, complex operations.
Let's move on to encryption. And back in the day when I was researching this a few years ago, full disk encryption used to be kind of the norm. And now it seems like Android has moved on to file disk encryption. Well, talk to us about what are the differences there.
It's been an interesting trend, right? When we think about our laptops, especially our work laptops, are usually full disk encryption. You might be using like BitLocker, for example. So Android had utilized full disk encryption for quite some time, starting with like Android 5 up to Android 9. And essentially what full disk encryption is that they're using a single key that's protected with your device password. And the idea is to use full disk encryption to protect the partition of the device that contains your user data, right? And so once your phone boots up, the user is required to enter in their credentials before any part of that disk is accessible, right? So I can't access my data until I enter in my PIN. And so this was great for security for quite some time. But there were some, we'll just say, negative impacts or consequences where most of the phone's core functionality was not immediately available when the users would reboot their device, right? So for example, full disk encryption was preventing the ability to receive phone calls or notifications, or I missed my meeting because my alarm didn't go off, right? And that was because the phone was in a limited functional state due to full disk encryption. So as a result, newer devices that are coming out, especially running, Android 10 and higher, full disk encryption is no longer supported, no longer recommended. Instead, Android has gone with file-based in encryption. So this was introduced in Android 7 and is supported since that version. And the main difference is that with file-based encryption, it allows the user to encrypt different files using different keys that can be unlocked independently, right? Essentially, we can now access more functionality of the phone because it's not fully encrypted. It's just on a file basis. And so one thing to also keep in mind is that you might, depending upon the applications that you use, you may have noticed that they also require you to enter a PIN as well, because that app may also be doing file-based encryption based on the data that it might be storing. So file disk encryption is another method, and I would say flexible method for protecting, private user information.
Is it on by default, and do folks need to do anything to make sure that it's actually gets triggered?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? When I boot up my laptop, for example, I get the blue screen, not of death, right? Not a BSOD, but hey, I got to enter in my my BitLocker password, for example. But what was really interesting with the file-based encryption approach that Android has taken is that they introduced a new feature called direct boot, right? And this allows the encrypted device to boot straight to the lock screen. And so with this approach, Android devices, they now offer two different or separate data storage locations that includes credential-based encrypted storage as well as device encrypted storage. So the main difference between those two is that with credential encrypted storage, first, it's the default storage location, but also it's only available after the user actually unlocks the device. And then there's device encrypted storage, where it's an additional storage location, but it is available both during direct boot mode as well as after the user has unlocked their device. So by default, apps don't run during direct boot mode, but they can request it if necessary. So it's been interesting to see how Android has taken this approach, but they're trying to find the best medium of security and privacy for their user, while also providing, we'll just say, reliable and stable performance for their devices.
So from a GRC standpoint, I mean, as long as you're buying a reputable brand, probably don't need to worry about the encryption. It's just happening by default.
I'd say for the most part, yes. But there are, I would say, additional encryption settings that you can enable for the OS as well as on a application basis, right? Okay. So from my perspective, definitely evaluate the encryption options that are available to you, and making sure that you're selecting and configuring them accordingly based on your organization's needs.
Yeah, folks, read the manual then. Yep. Okay, so we have a lost device then. What are the risks? We have an encrypted device, but how could a bad guy potentially get in? Talk to us about the risks here.
Yeah, and I always go back to the CIA triad, right? How does this situation or scenario impact confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the device and of the data that it contains, right? So first and foremost, let's say, you lost your device or it's stolen, before that happens, just make sure that you're using a strong PIN, right? This is going to make it harder for an attacker or some random person to get into your phone, right? Yeah. It's good to see that apps and Android devices are moving away from a 4-digit PIN, right? It's very easy to brute force that, for example. Also, you don't want to use very predictable pins, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of you out there have that. So please, please change your pin. And again, it's in your best interest to do that in case your phone is lost or stolen. From an organization perspective, by using an MDM, making sure that you can wipe the device remotely. That way, if there was an insecure PIN that was used, they gain access to the phone. They're not going to be able to access any sensitive data that might be on it. But also, one thing I would also recommend is that, given that our lives are on our phone, and we associate and integrate a lot of our personal accounts and work accounts on our phones. If you do lose your device or if it's stolen, make sure to just immediately change the passwords for those accounts that are associated with the device.
Yeah.
That way, it can just limit the damage and making sure that any unauthorized user doesn't gain additional unauthorized access to your personal accounts or to additional network accounts within your organization.
That brings up a great point. I was talking with one of my friends and he showed me this little thin wallet, and he only had, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 cards in there, whereas a lot of people, including myself, we carry everything, every single card we've ever been given, credit cards and all that. So from a mobile device standpoint, that point you just brought up, maybe you don't need certain apps on your phone. You know what I mean? Especially if you don't use them ever, because that just introduces additional risk. And maybe there are certain apps that are so sensitive, have such sensitive information, or, bank accounts or whatever the case might be. If your phone is lost and somehow compromised, those are the keys, to your life in many cases. So great point. Least functionality principle comes in, as well as, just, I don't even know what I would call it. Just don't put stuff on there that you don't need.
Exactly. It's great to have a minimal profile on your phone.
Well, let's talk about decommissioning a phone. We're going to trade it in, give it back, or we're just going to, maybe put it into recycling, something or other. Does a factory reset do the trick, or are there remnants left over? What do we got to worry about here?
Yeah. So, and again, this podcast interview is just perfect timing because I literally just did this, trading in my previous phone this past weekend. So with a factory reset, first and foremost, definitely follow the directions that Android and your carrier will provide to ensure that your data is removed properly, right? So what exactly is a factory reset? Sometimes it's referred to as like a hard reset or a master reset, but what you're doing is returning the Android device to its original factory settings, right? You can think back to when you first get the phone and you get that welcome splash screen, right? The hello or whatnot, where there's not much on the phone. That's the state that you're trying to return it back to, right? And so when you perform this factory reset, what you're doing is executing a process that will remove all data, all personal data, your settings, any applications you've had installed, and it'll go the extra mile and actually remove any passwords that's on the device, any credit card information, because we all pay with our phones now, as well as any paired devices, right? Whether you have headphone devices like Bluetooth wireless devices, tablets, TVs, etc. Wants to make sure that data doesn't remain on the device as well. What I recommend is, just for peace of mind, clear any cache data that's on your phone, right? Sign out of all accounts, whether, in your browser, social media, streaming services. Make sure your as well as your work accounts as well. Sign out of them. That way, it disassociates those accounts from the device.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do this before performing the factory reset.
Yeah.
So, by taking those steps, performing the factory reset, you can, for the most part, rest assured that a lot of the critical and sensitive data has been removed from your device. However, from a corporate IT perspective, I also recommend, I think is a worthwhile step to take is once you've wiped the device, analyze it with data recovery software just to verify that there's no lingering data remnants, right? Say, for example, you perform the factory reset and there was an interruption in the process, right? Or maybe it didn't complete successfully the first time, or didn't complete entirely. There's some data that could still be on that device, right? And so, again, doing what will allow you to sleep at night, always trust but verify that there's no lingering data on that device from an organization perspective.
And that's a great point also about removing the accounts before you do the factory reset, especially on the server side, quote unquote, because if you're logging into Microsoft, it has your list of devices that you've used in the past and that it doesn't trust them per se, because of zero trust and all that. But, there's a certain level of trust there. And so if you just remove the account from your phone or factory reset, well, that device entry is still on that service. So, and, like I said, we all have a ton of applications on our phones. So remembering which platform you used and all that stuff, it'd be impossible if you didn't do it beforehand. So that's a great point.
Yeah. And I always recommend, because I also travel a lot, and when I use different services, it'll remind me, hey, we can't add, like, say I want to cast from my phone to like a TV, right? I have to add that device to my phone or to that service, and it'll say, hey, there's too many devices associated with this account, right? So it's always good as a part of your like cybersecurity hygiene, just to refresh and review what accounts you have associated with your phone, and asking yourself, do I really need to have this connection and association in place?
All right. Right in line with lost devices comes international travel. Should people just leave their mobile devices at home? What do you think?
It's a great question. I was doing, I'd say, a lot of personal international travel. And this year I've had the opportunity to travel internationally for work as well. And this was a big topic for our team and working with our IT and security team. So first, I would ask, like, do you really need to access your work apps, like your email or files, while you're overseas? Or is it really just for like occasional check-ins, right? Oh, I just want to just check in with my team over Slack or, over whichever, chat service you're using. But the question really comes down to, what's the necessity, right? I would also take into account the sensitivity of the data on the device, right? Does your work device contain any highly confidential company data? And so if there's a high risk there, the higher the stakes, the more cautious you definitely need to be. And then considering, what are your company policies, right? Does your organization have specific guidelines or restrictions on using work devices internationally? So, usually as a U.S.-based defense contracting company, we can't take our work laptops overseas for given reasons, but definitely have those discussions with your supervisors, with your IT team, as far as what guidance your company is providing when traveling across the pond, right? And with that, and sometimes people may overlook, but consider what your destination is, and are there any risks that are associated with that region, right? So some countries, they might have higher rates of cybercrime, or even just government surveillance in general. So definitely research your the cybersecurity environment and hygiene for the destination that you're traveling to. But if you determine I must take my phone overseas, I can't live without it, then there's a couple steps that you can take to maximize your security and privacy, right? As I mentioned, talk to IT and your security about your travel plans, and then work with them to properly lock down the device, ensuring that you're using strong passwords along with encryption, that you're disabling any unnecessary features, also recommending using maybe a more restricted work profile, and of course having the ability to perform that remote wiping in case your work phone gets confiscated overseas, right? In addition, I would recommend avoiding public Wi-Fi when possible, and disabling automatic Wi-Fi connections, right? It's great when I can go into a hotel that I'm a part of that hotel network. I want to get the points and rewards, and it can just automatically connect me to their hotel Wi-Fi, even though I'm in a different country. That has some security risks with it, right? So make sure you're disabling those automatic Wi-Fi connections. And absolutely use a VPN, even if you don't think that there's any security issues or risks. Making sure that your data, your communications are encrypted, right? And then lastly, just don't leave your phone unattended, right? It's very easy to just get up and go to the bathroom or to get your coffee from the cafe. You walk away from the table, you come back and your phone is gone, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying anyone will do this, but we all love taking photos of ourselves and selfies. But like, of course, don't give your phone to a stranger to take a picture, right? I know we want to do it for the gram, but again, make sure that your phone stays in your possession at all times.
I just want to hammer down on something you just said, the talking to IT and security about making sure that, you know, your phone's configured properly and everything. Sometimes these phones drift a bit, and they may not be syncing with the MDM at all. And, you know, cyber and IT, I mean, they can be overtaxed and they may not know it, you know. So definitely check in, make sure your device is, you know, working properly, synced with the MDM, because if you lost your phone and then like, oh no, we got to wipe it, and they can't because there's some sort of technical problem, you want to make sure that's accounted for ahead of time.
And along those lines, being able just to monitor for suspicious activity, right? Yeah. If someone is randomly logging in at the wee hours in the morning, when everyone is sleeping, they'll be able to see that suspicious activity in the MDM logs, right? So you bring up a great point, making sure to make sure your MDM is synced properly to that device.
Yeah, that's right. Something else I'll mention is Samsung Knox. They have some interesting additional security features that you can enable. You referred to previously about using kind of like a dual factor authentication where you have a strong PIN, but then you also have a fingerprint, you know, requirement or something like that. And they have to do both to actually unlock the phone. So it might be worth looking at some of those stronger authentication methods for folks traveling internationally, like you said, if they have to take it.
Yeah, and I would say Samsung Knox was an industry game changer with just as being like a robust layered like security platform of like, I consider like Samsung Knox as Android security on steroids, right? Where it's not just focused on securing, you know, applications of the operating system, but they're implementing security measures from the hardware all the way up to the OS and applications as well. So yeah, it was great to see that released, and really it was just a step towards, again, taking security more seriously and really pushing the boundaries and serving as, you know, trailblazers in creating truly secure mobile devices.
Mobile device management. What actually is it? And maybe some of the mobile device management profiles that are out there and are common.
Yeah, there's definitely a variety of MDMs out there. I remember when just the term BYOD, right, bring your own device, was first introduced, because no one really thought about that, I would say, back in the day of, oh, I can just bring my cell phone, or even just getting a work issued phone. And so, again, right, mobile device management allows you to create and manage different work profiles and that are employed on work devices, And even we'll talk about how you can use them with personal devices as well. But ultimately, what's happening is you're going to set up a separate work profile. Since we're focused on Android security, one thing that they offer is Android Enterprise, right? This was formerly known as Android for Work, right? And this offered a secure way to separate your work apps and data from your personal content on your own device or your dedicated work device. So, in order to use Android Enterprise, you want to make sure that you're using one of the modern Android OS versions. I think it's like Android 5 and above. And of course, you're using an MDM solutions. There's a variety of them out there, whether it's like Google Endpoint Management, Microsoft Intune, etc. But you want to make sure that you have the right device version and MDM solution in place. And then, once you get past all the like prereqs, right? Ultimately, your company IT, they're going to create and set up your profile on the device, right? And this enables you to, or at least enables the company to create a separate work environment on your device, which is pretty cool when you think about it, right? When it comes to work applications, they can be installed and managed within that work profile. But also your personal apps, they remain separate and inaccessible from the work profile. So you have that nice application separation. But you also have data separation, right? So when you think about work data, this could be emails, it could be your documents, they could be files. They're also stored separately in an encrypted container within your work profile. And so this keeps it isolated from your personal data, right? I would say what's interesting, especially like working from home, for example, or working remotely, oftentimes I'll use my personal device, right? But as I'm on the go, I'm like, oh, I need to access, say, a work resource, right? Well, with using an MDM solution as well, organizations can actually route traffic through their VPN, right? So my employer at the time, said, hey, use this VPN profile, connect to it, and then this will allow you to access the company infrastructure from your phone, right? We were small enough, we didn't need an MDM, an official formal MDM, but we could at least utilize VPNs and security gateways for enhanced protection. So protecting not only work traffic, but making sure that my personal traffic remains unaffected as well. So I'd say that's the core of it. But by using MDMs, again, it enables greater compliance and security, right? Your IT admins, they can apply security policies to the work profile, ensuring, hey, this user is definitely using a strong password. We can remote unlock or lock the device or wipe it. They can restrict application installations, right? There's the big controversy over whether or not we can use TikTok on our phone, for example, right? As well as just managing data sharing, where ensuring work data doesn't get copied over to your personal device and vice versa, right? So there's definitely a lot of benefits that MDMs can provide while still ensuring that your end user, your employees are still productive while on the go or working remotely.
Talk to us about attacks on MDMs.
So this is fun. This is where I get excited, right? Like defense through offense. MDMs, they can be attacked or compromised in different ways, right? So I'll break it up into, there's the MDM itself, you have the MDM accounts, and then you have like the MDM devices, right? And so when you think about the MDM software or server, it likely contains vulnerabilities, right? They likely have known exploitable vulnerabilities that attackers may leverage to compromise the MDM software. Or you may have attackers that are looking for zero-day vulnerabilities. These are unknown vulnerabilities that attackers are looking for to exploit to gain unauthorized access or to perform different types of cyber effects. But essentially, these unknown vulnerabilities are not reported to the vendor. They're not publicly disclosed. And so those are very critical when it comes to like MDM attacks. Another common theme is that, perhaps the MDM server and software aren't updated often, which can leave them vulnerable to attacks. And then another area which can also be overlooked because it can be subtle are misconfigurations, right? If the MDM is configured incorrectly, whether the password settings didn't stick or there's open ports for that MDM, these can create or present like security holes that attackers are looking for in order to actively exploit. So that's like how MDM themselves might be targeted. Then we think about, okay, well, what do MDMs provide, right? They have accounts that provide users to access the work infrastructure and work resources. And so those accounts could be targeted and compromised, whether through phishing attacks, again, over email or through SMS to steal login credentials. Attackers might try to brute force the passwords to gain unauthorized access to the MDM. And we hear about like data breaches happening all the time, unfortunately. Even last month, I just got a letter from a vendor saying, hey, we've had a disclosure. And so why am I bringing this up? It is because attackers are looking at the results of these data breaches. They're trying to gather and scrape data offline, from the internet in order to use those stolen credentials and possibly get access to your MDM accounts. And then lastly, we have the actual devices, right? If there's, say, an Android device, a mobile device that's enrolled in, the MDM network, an attacker might try to exploit the apps on the phone and escalate their privileges to then gain unauthorized access to the MDM. And so we talk about these different types or categories of attacks because they can result in different types of consequences, right? Whether it's a data breach, whether it's a device takeover or network infiltration, we want to make sure that you have the right, policies in place and that you're configuring your MDMs properly so that, you don't end up on the news like a lot of companies have been recently. So
these systems, they're good, right? They bring in additional security, but it's a whole nother layer of complexity that we have to deal with. And as your point of misconfigurations, that's a huge problem. So making sure that people are properly trained, and hopefully having more than one person so they can check their work, and catch if somebody messed something up, it's easy to do. So what are the weak security areas in the Android operating system that GRC teams and cyber teams should be aware of?
Again, it's like, where do we start? But I would say that the common areas for Android OS as well as mobile security in general is we still see, unfortunately, like the common use of outdated operating systems and devices, right? As I mentioned, with the release of Android 15 last week, Android 11 is no longer supported, I think, as of February of this year. So making sure, again, you're updating to the latest Android operating system. Even manufacturers are restricting how long they support their devices, right? Since Samsung has been a common device we've been discussing, in the past, it was just 5 years of support. Now they've extended it to 7 for the S24, but making sure that you're doing a device or technology refresh to ensure that, again, you're using the latest devices with the most modern security protections. We haven't really touched on it too much, but I would be mindful of what apps that you install via the Google Play Store, right? The Google Play Store is the official Android app store that's overseen by Google. And so when you are considering downloading an app from the Play Store, just verify the developer of the application so that you're using not only an official software version, but it's going to be trusted, right? And verified. I know that not many people may want to use the Google Play Store. Instead, they want to just sideload apps, right? I can just go to the vendor's website and download it from there. Unfortunately, there's security risks that come with that, right? Even though Android does allow for app sideloading, you want to prevent users from downloading and installing apps from untrusted sources that are outside of the Google Play Store, because this is only going to increase the risk of potential, say, like malware infection, for example. When it comes to applications, it's very easy just to agree to all their terms of service and to consent to, let's say, the different permission requests and notifications that you may get when you download that app. I will say this, being mindful of the broad permissions that those apps may request and may require, because again, you could be giving that application unnecessary access to sensitive data or device functions that could easily be misused or abused, right? And then lastly, I would say another hot topic would be supply chain risks, right? As I mentioned, with the Android ecosystem, we have a variety of device manufacturers, application developers, and so on. And so when you first purchase your device, you're going to notice that there's going to be what we call like pre-installed bloatware, where the manufacturers pre-install their applications, or even the carriers as well. And those pre-installed apps may have security flaws or collect excessive data. So you just want to be mindful of those. And then lastly, similar to avoiding the side loading of apps, also avoiding or preventing installing custom ROMs, right? Modified versions of Android. Usually you get them from unverified sources, but they can introduce vulnerabilities or potentially compromise the security of the device. So those are just some things to be mindful of. They're not necessarily Android specific, right? The Google Play Store is specific to Android, but you have the App Store for iOS. Mm-hmm. So just things to keep in mind, especially if you're going to allow a BYOD, bring your own device policy for work, or if you're issuing work phones for your employees.
To your point about being careful what apps you're installing, I mean, I think another thing to hammer on is just that least functionality concept. If you don't need it for work, cyber GRC IT teams, you really shouldn't provision it. And especially if there's apps that you're just not kind of not sure of, well, why are they asking for this? What is this? And they're like, hey, it has 2 million users. That's not always a indicator that can be trusted, because as we've seen,
5 stars.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because we've seen some really well adopted applications out there that are probably games or something else like that, but they actually have some extra goodies attached that do some things that we don't want. So great points.
Yeah, but I can still play Candy Crush, right?
I hope so. I don't know. Well, let's talk about some recent and upcoming security enhancements in the Android operating system. One of them that I saw that was quite interesting was clipboard security. So that's something that nobody would ever think of. But I think in Android 13, all apps could access the clipboard. And if you think about what you might be copying and pasting and what might be in your clipboard, you could have passwords in there. You could have, who knows what could be in there. And every single app had access to that. But they changed it, right? Talk to us about it.
When Android 13 came out, they had introduced what's known as the clipboard protection feature. And essentially, you can think of this as a gatekeeper that is monitoring when applications are requesting access to the clipboard, whether it's writing data to the clipboard, reading data from it. Oftentimes, like for example, as you were mentioning, when you get a two-factor authentication code, right? It pops up in the clipboard, very easy to use to paste into the app that I'm using. And so the last thing you want is for a malicious app to get access to that type of data, right? And so that's what the clipboard protection feature is trying to prevent. It's trying to prevent unauthorized access or misuse of the clipboard. I think they also introduced like a time of life or time lapse feature where after an hour or so, any data on the clipboard, it'll remove or delete. That way it's not persistent. And you just have this long log of clipboard entries that could potentially be abused. So yeah, I think, again, this is just another great step that Android and Google have taken to improve the security of their device and improve the user experience as well. So yeah, it was great to see that come out. Another area that we're also seeing, again, Google and Android being trailblazers in the field, is that there's this great move or push towards using Rust, right? Rust is a memory safe programming language. And so Google is actually rewriting Android, which is usually based in C, C++. They're moving over to in Java as well, but they're moving towards Rust in order to reduce memory safety vulnerabilities. You can think of like buffer overflows, for example. If you're not familiar with a buffer overflow, imagine a bucket and you're filling it up with water. And once you get to the top of that bucket, the water spills over onto the floor, corrupting or messing up everything around it, right? That's like a buffer overflow, but instead it's containing more data than it should. By Android moving more towards using Rust, it's going to make exploitation of the Android operating system increasingly difficult, right? It's going to make my job very hard. But it's also their initiatives are also ensuring that Android is secure by design. And so it is, I would say, a great example of Google and Android showcasing that you can offer secure products that perform well, that are practical and easy to use, but are also compliant with the most recent, we'll say, executive orders and cybersecurity standards and regulations that are being released, over the past 4 years. So yeah, hats off to Google and Android for that. And just as a more recent example, I think last week, Google just released a blog post about how they're further hardening their firmware to boost Android security. So they were actually able to extend their use of Rust at the firmware level, right? So not just at the app level, not just at the operating system level, but at the firmware level, which is huge, right? It's a pretty huge accomplishment. So Google is looking at, in addition to that, exploring how they can enable different exploit mitigations as well as other memory safety features at the firmware level to, again, improve and extend the security posture of Android. But what they definitely need to keep in mind is how they're going to balance security with functionality, performance, as well as stability and reliability of their devices for the end user.
That'll be interesting. I mean, because as a reverse engineer, I guess maybe you have to learn Rust, I suppose.
Absolutely. That's the great thing about the field we work in. We're always learning new technologies, new languages, new tools and techniques. So I love it.
Well, we talked about a lot of stuff. So let's summarize. If you're a cybersecurity team, IT team, GRC team, what have you, what are the most important steps that they need to take to secure Android devices?
All right. So I would say if there's one thing you take away from this podcast episode, because we've covered a lot, which has been great. I've been loving the conversation. But definitely I would say here are the key takeaways that you can immediately apply within your organization, right? One, choose reputable MDM vendors, right? Especially if you're at that size of a company where it makes sense to use one. Also, keep your systems updated regularly, implementing those security patches and OS updates that come out. Make sure you're using strong passwords and enabling multi-factor authentication. Make sure you're employing proper network security measures as well as device security measures for your Android devices. Make sure your IT team is performing regular security audits, not just collecting the data, but also reviewing it. That is an important step. And then lastly, if possible, conduct security awareness training for your workforce, right? Understanding the not only the benefits of using mobile devices, but the potential security risks and how to use your Android or mobile device securely and effectively, as well as productively with it, while at work.
I almost hate to ask this, but
bring it on.
In your opinion, what is more secure, Apple or Android?
Another great debate question. Both platforms have their strengths and weaknesses. And just to clear the air, because I know earlier I mentioned that I currently use iPhone, but actually for several years I did use Android all the way up through college, right? So I have been an Android user and I've also been an iPhone user. And so if we kind of talk about the pros and cons, right? When it comes to Apple, they have a few advantages. For example, they have a tightly controlled ecosystem. They have a very high vetting system to ensure that safe and secure software and devices are a part of their ecosystem to protect their users, right? They also have fast or rapid rollouts of updates. And also what's interesting is that they do have stronger security settings that are enabled by default compared to Android. However, because of their tightly controlled ecosystem, there's, we'll say, limited customizations or choices for the end users. In addition, iPhones and Apple products are usually more expensive compared to Android, right? And that's probably why I used Android early in my career before I started making money. So, but again, those are some of the pros and cons, right? And then with Android, what's great about it is that it's open source, right? You and I can contribute to the ASOP. It allows us to have granular control in customizations where we can apply Android to different devices. It's much easier to develop an Android app and get that approved on the Google Play Store, right? Yeah. And so I'd say one of the main benefits of Android is that it does provide more diversity and choice of apps and devices for the general public. But that does introduce issues, right? We have this fragmented ecosystem across Android. And even though it is easy to develop Android apps and get it approved on the Google Play Store, there have been App Store security issues. However, I will say Google Play Store have been, making great progress and taking great strides to improve their vetting process. That way they can prevent malicious apps on their platform. So again, being in both camps, overall, just, choose the platform that best suits your needs, but definitely don't forget to prioritize strong security practices and definitely stay informed about security threats, regardless of the device that you choose.
And I'll begrudgingly say that on the Apple side, I do think that one of the strongest benefits or the strongest pro is that, you got a standard platform out there. It might be various models, but it's not various brands, creating that fragmented ecosystem. Because from a carrier standpoint, when they, if they support multiple Android brands as well as derivative models underneath all of those brands, man, they might have a lot of work to do to get out a patch. But Absolutely. On the Apple side, I mean, it's standardized. So
I'll give more streamlined. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you that. Give us some resources. If people want to dive in deeper, what can they read?
Yeah, if you want to learn more about Android security, highly recommend checking out our Android security research playbook. It's actually how we got acquainted with you coming across it and reaching out. So our playbook, we look at as more of a getting started guide to learn about like the introduction to Android security, as well as a common methodology for performing Android security research, right? So we talk about the different security mechanisms that Android uses, how they can be bypassed, and different ways to protect yourself. You can access the Android security research playbook. We call it ASRP for short, but you can access that at asrp.darkwolf.io. Also recommend checking out our website for Dark Wolf Solutions. You can access the playbook there as well. So check out darkwolfsolutions.com. We just graduated from a small business at the end of 2023. So we are hiring. Definitely check out our job openings. But also, if you're interested in working with Dark Wolf Solutions, when it comes to Android security or just cybersecurity in general, software DevSecOps and digital transformation. Again, check out our website at darkwolfsolutions.com. And feel free to reach out to me, right? You can connect with me on LinkedIn, and we make sure you'll get a link to that. But you can also email me at hahna.latonick@darkwolfsolutions.com. And also you can contact Darkwolf at info@darkwolfsolutions.com.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I'm so happy that you reached out. Thoroughly enjoyed this podcast, and what you're doing with the GRC Academy is a great thing. So definitely keep being awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, folks, hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.